Hello and welcome to Chapter 9 of our FSPCA curriculum on preventive controls for animal food. In this chapter, we are going to cover a type of preventive control called a supply chain applied control. And typically, when we're talking about supply chain programs, this type of supply chain control is going to look a little bit different, or this type of supply chain program is going to look a little bit different than what most facilities already have in place. Typically, when we're talking about a supply chain program, it usually consists of a list of what we call approved suppliers within the facility. And that means that these are suppliers that you have relationships with, that their quality of product is up to your facility standards. And these are people that you can go to buy product from, and you know you're going to get what you want. In this context of supply chains, remember that this whole point of this regulation is safety. So when we're talking about suppliers within the context of this regulation, the definition is a little bit different. It is safety focused, not quality focused. And these suppliers are the ones that are controlling a hazard for you. Okay, so your typical already working supply chain program is existing outside of this supply chain program, of these supply chain applied controls. Okay, I think what we're going to see most common in the industry is that these are going to be applied to control chemical hazards such as toxicities or pesticide residues, but I think there's other situations that this could be used as well. And really, as with all of the other ones, but I think especially in this type of control, communication and documentation is absolutely critical at every level. Here are the objectives for this chapter. First and foremost, we're going to look at the purpose of a supply chain program and look at some definitions associated with the supply chain applied controls. We're going to look at what the regulation says is required of this supply chain program and what kind of documentation and records we need to keep as well. Now, just as a reminder, there is another regulation under FSMA, under the Food Safety Modernization Act, called the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, and that exists outside of these supply chain applied controls. That regulation looks similar to these supply chain applied controls, but there's some extra definitions and some different record keeping that has to happen within that foreign supplier verification program. So, and that's only if you are using foreign suppliers and importing product. So if you're in that situation, you definitely will want to either take a course or do some research on the foreign supplier verification program, in addition to paying particular attention to this Chapter 9. Here's the regulation on the supply chain program. The supply chain program does have its own subpart. So we've already looked at subparts A, B, C, D, and F. And now we're looking at subpart E, which is the supply chain program. So here are the different parts of this subpart. And keep in mind that a supply chain applied control is considered a preventive control or a type of preventive control. But just because the nature of this type of control is so different than the other two examples of our sanitation control and our process control, it's given its own subpart and it's managed a little bit differently. Those other two types of preventive controls are controlled in-house in the facility, and this type of control is controlled at the supplier, so outside of the facility. So very different situation, very different management style here. We've seen this graphic before. This is just a reminder of the different options of preventive controls. In chapters 6 and 7, we talked about process controls. Chapter 8 was all about sanitation controls, and now we're in the supply chain applied control world. Within this particular subpart, there are two really critical definitions for receiving facility and supplier. And I think these are going to look different than what we've seen in the past. So here's the definition of a receiving facility. This is the facility that is subject to subpart C. So remember in chapter 1, we went over some of the exemptions, and not every facility is subject to subpart C. So this is a facility that is subject to subpart C and will have to do a food safety plan. And usually if you're subject to subpart C, you're also subject to subpart E because it's a preventive control. So subject to subpart C and E of this part, and that manufactures or processes a raw material or other ingredient that it receives from a supplier. Okay, so a receiving facility is typically some facility that is doing a manufacturing process. Okay, so they're manipulating the feed in some way and then selling it to somebody else, whether that means an end user or a retail facility or another manufacturer or processor. A receiving facility is just someone that does something of consequence and is subject to subpart C and E. Okay. Now, it also says that they receive something from a supplier. So let's take a look at the definition of a supplier. A supplier is the establishment that manufactures or processes the animal food, raises the animal, or grows the food that is provided to a receiving facility without further manufacturing or process by another establishment, except for further manufacturing processes that consist solely of the addition of labeling or a similar activity of de minimis nature. Okay, so let's think about this definition. Who does this apply to? What does this sound like? Someone that raises the animal or grows the food? Well, that sounds like a farm, right? That fits within our definition of a farm. So a farmer could be a supplier to a receiving facility. This could also be someone that manufactures or processes the animal food, so someone that is doing something of consequence to that animal food. Okay, in the definitions section of the regulation, which is 507.3, there is a definition of manufacturing and processing, or manufacturers/processes, and it gives you a list of all of the activities that are considered manufacturing and processing. If you haven't read through that list or are not as familiar with those types of activities, I would pause this recording right now, go take a look at those different activities so you have an idea of what it means to do something of consequence to the animal food. Usually this is going to be some sort of physical or chemical change to the animal food itself. This does include mixing if you're mixing different types of feed. Okay, so a supplier is someone that does something of consequence or raises the animal or grows the food. So now let's take a look at the definition of a supply chain applied control. This is a preventive control for a hazard in a raw material or other ingredient when the hazard in the raw material or other ingredient is controlled before its receipt. Okay, so essentially, if a receiving facility goes through its hazard analysis process, identifies a hazard requiring a preventive control, and then decides that they are going to ask their supplier to control that hazard for them, they are using a supply chain applied control. So before it ever gets to their door, the supplier has controlled that hazard for them and it's not coming into the facility. I think oftentimes we're going to see this used in a conjunction with some of the other types of preventive controls. So in addition to having a supply chain applied control, you're also going to have a process control or a sanitation control. That's not to say you have to do it that way, but I think that's going to be a common practice. So when is a supply chain program required? This is required if both of the following things are true, and this is kind of what I just said on the last slide. First of all, the facility has identified they have a hazard requiring a preventive control. Remember that not all facilities are going to come to that decision. Some facilities will not have a hazard requiring a preventive control. Okay, so step one, they do have to decide they have a hazard requiring a preventive control. And then the facility has to determine that a supply chain applied control is the appropriate control for that identified hazard. Okay, so this all comes from your food safety team thinking through that hazard analysis process and identifying the best ways to control each of those hazards that require a preventive control. When this is not required, well, if you don't have a hazard requiring a preventive control, you do not need to do a supply chain applied control. That's not to say that there can't be some agreements amongst your suppliers built into your GMP program that look similar to this. I think that's a pretty common thing in the industry as well, where you have some COAs and attestations and agreements between supplier and receiver. However, that's managed within the CGMP program because none of your hazards are at a high enough risk level to require a preventive control. Okay. You also do not need to do this if you're controlling the hazard within the receiving facility. I think this is going to be a really common thing to see where receiving facilities are just going to choose to implement a process control and not worry about a supply chain applied control, simply because it gets a little bit complicated and there's a lot of paperwork behind it. So we're going to run through some scenarios that kind of try to emphasize that idea of how complicated this can get really quickly. You also don't need to implement a supply chain applied control if a customer or downstream entity controls the hazard for you. Okay, so that was kind of a caveat that was built into another part of the regulation. And essentially what that says is that if you sell a product that is labeled as not controlling that hazard, for example, like this product is not salmonella free, and you have an agreement between you and your customer, this is like a legal documented agreement that says the customer is going to control the hazard, then you do not need to implement a supply chain applied control or a preventive control within your facility. Okay, so this is kind of a weird piece of the regulation, but I think it gives some flexibility to, people that are manufacturing raw dog food or raw pet food, or those rendering facilities that just can't sell product as salmonella free. So there is a piece of the regulation that says you can have the customer control that hazard for you. Okay. An importer is in compliance with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. So like I said, that's very similar to this supply chain applied control. So if you're adhering to the FSVP, you do not need to adhere to this part of the regulation. It kind of just doesn't make sense. They overlap so much. Or if the food is supplied for research or evaluation use. Okay, so if you are using it just for research, then you do not need to worry about controlling the hazard through your supplier. There is a few more references in the box on next to this slide in the student manual if you want to look at a little bit more context between each of these situations. Now we're going to look at some examples of different situations where we can have receiving facilities asking suppliers to control hazards for them. So this first one is a pretty simple one. Over on the left-hand side, we have a supplier that looks like it's probably some sort of farmer, a grain producer, or an ingredient supplier. They are going to sell their product to a manufacturing or processing facility, which we're assuming is subject to subpart C and E and is going to be considered a receiving facility. So in this situation, the receiving facility, the manufacturing facility, is asking the farmer to control the hazard for them. And then this receiving facility is going to sell to their end user, which is apparently a sheep farmer that's going to feed this product to their animals. Okay, that's pretty simple. Let's take a look at a little bit more complicated situation. Here's a little bit more complicated situation. So now we have several players in this supply chain, and some of these are nondescript, like intermediaries. We can kind of consider those to be maybe brokers or grain elevators or transportation companies. So each of these bubbles is representing a change of ownership, but not necessarily a change of responsibility for controlling these hazards. Okay, so let's start over on the left-hand side. We have the supplier. Again, this is going to be some sort of farmer, because all raw ingredients are going to start at some sort of farmer level. So at this point, our supplier is a farmer, maybe a grain producer again. Well, that farmer is going to sell to the next company, which may be some sort of transportation company, for example, maybe a trucking company. Okay, so this is changed ownership, changed hands. That trucking company is then going to sell to maybe a grain elevator or some other facility, but this facility is either not subject to Subpart C or doesn't do anything of consequence to the product. Okay, so maybe they're again just storing it and holding it for a certain period of time. Okay, again, we've changed ownership, we've changed hands with this product. Maybe we have some other products coming into this facility as well, but nothing of consequence has been done to this product yet. They are then going to sell this product again to our manufacturing and receiving facility. Okay, so this is, for example, maybe a feed mill. This is someone who is grinding, mixing, pelleting, doing something that falls under that category of manufacturing or processing. So they are the receiving facility. They are subject to Subpart C. They're doing a food safety plan and a hazard analysis, and they've identified that they have a hazard requiring a preventive control. Okay, so if they want to have a supply chain applied control, they have to go all the way back to the supplier, the farmer in this situation, and ask them to control this hazard for them. The person they bought it from, that grain elevator that they bought it from, has some parts of the regulation that they're subject to, but they cannot ask, this receiving facility cannot ask the grain elevator to control this hazard for them because they didn't do anything of consequence to that product, and therefore they don't fall under the definition of a supplier. Okay, so if you're currently working in a feed mill facility or a facility that manufactures animal food, I want you to take a minute and think about whether you have contact with someone that falls under that supplier definition. Who do you actually buy your product from? Do you buy it from a broker? Do you buy it from an elevator that brings in several products from several different sources? What do those relationships look like? And if you were asked to, could you go to your supplier or suppliers and ask them to control a hazard for you? Okay, most receiving facilities or most animal food facilities that I've worked with buy from hundreds of farmers, and they don't even talk to those farmers, right? They buy it from a second party that brings all of that product together, and so they don't have a relationship with those people. So just thinking about trying to track down all of those farmers, come up with a contract between each of those farmers, is a really daunting task for a lot of facilities. Some facilities can do that. Some facilities just buy from a couple of local farmers and bring their product to them. For like co-ops, for example, might be able to use this particular type of preventive control. But I think for the most part, we're going to see that this gets really complicated when you're trying to keep track of all of these relationships and make sure you have all the documentation in place. Okay, and even from here, that receiving facility can sell to another person. Maybe this is another transportation company or a retail facility before it even gets to that end user. Okay, so the point being, there is a lot of players in this whole process, going from farmer to end user. It changes hands a lot within the animal food industry. And so keeping track of all of that and making sure that you're asking the correct people to control these hazards for you can get a little bit complicated. Now, I've been asked the question a lot, well, why can't I ask my trucking company to control this hazard for you? Are they just going to be not even paying attention to the quality of the feed as they're moving and delivering it? And the answer to that is no. They are going to be subject to the sanitary transport rule under FSMA. So even though they're not subject to Part 507, even though they're not subject to Subpart C of Part 507, and they're not doing something of consequence and therefore can't be considered a supplier, there is other regulation out there that's making sure they're still protecting your product. And also keep in mind, there is a blanket expectation that everyone involved in this entire chain has a responsibility to not adulterate the food. Okay, so this doesn't, leave holes, doesn't leave gaps open for people to be irresponsible with the animal food. It's just saying that this particular preventive control is set up this way between facilities that do something of consequence to these particular products. This is the point where we are supposed to stop and do the first exercise for Chapter 9. And in the classroom, I always like to demonstrate this exercise using M&Ms as a grain product, and then passing those M&Ms or selling those M&Ms between different types of facilities. And at each step, I always ask my students, who is the supplier and who is the receiving facility? So this slide is set up kind of in the same way where we have different facilities and we're going to be passing product between those different types of facilities, and I'm going to ask you guys to think about the same thing. In every transaction, who is the supplier and who is the receiving facility? Okay. We have farmers on the left-hand side of our screen here to start with that are going to be growing the raw ingredient. In this situation, we're going to assume that this is going to be corn, is going to be our raw ingredient. And then on the lower right-hand corner, we see that the feed mill is down there, is going to be our ultimate end to where this product is going. Okay, we are going to be dealing with two separate products. Our raw ingredient here to start with is going to be represented by a solid line. Again, that's going to be corn. And then later on in the process, we're going to use a dashed line to represent DDGS, which is dried distiller grains with solubles in it. So it's after some corn has been processed. So let's just follow along and see how this situation kind of plays out and where our corn goes to. So first of all, the farmers are going to sell their product to the same country elevator. So both these farmers are selling to the same country elevator. Country elevator is not going to be subject to Subpart C. The only thing that they're going to be doing with this product is commingling it with other corn products from other corn from other farmers. Okay? That country elevator is then going to sell to a grain terminal. Again, we can assume that at this point we're going to be just commingling corn again from other country elevators or maybe even other farmers at this point. That grain terminal is then going to sell to two different facilities. The first facility is going to be the feed mill directly. Okay, so we can assume that the feed mill is going to be grinding or pelleting and manufacturing that animal food. So in this first situation, who is the receiving facility and who is their supplier? If you answered that the feed mill was the receiving facility, you are correct. This feed mill is subject to Subpart C. They're trying to find ways to implement preventive controls to control these hazards. Okay, but who is their supplier? If you think about this, we have two farmers on the screen that are going to be their suppliers. The grain terminal didn't do anything of consequence. The country elevator didn't do anything of consequence. But the farmers do fall under that supplier definition because they grow the food itself, they grow the ingredient itself. So we have two farmers on the screen that are suppliers. But we also had some corn commingled at the country elevator, which brings in more suppliers. And then we had more commingling at the grain terminal, which brought in even more suppliers. So to answer the question, who are the suppliers to this feed mill? We don't know. We don't know how many farmers could possibly be contributing to the final truckload that makes its way to the feed mill. Okay? This grain terminal could also sell some product to a biofuels manufacturer. And through the biofuels manufacturing process, again, the biofuels manufacturer is going to be doing something of consequence to this product, right? So through that manufacturing process, they come out with those DDGSs, those dried distiller grains with solubles, and then they're going to sell those to the same feed mill. Okay, so in this situation, we think about who is the receiving facility and who is the supplier. Well, if we're talking about the feed mill itself, the receiving facility is the feed mill. They are subject to Subpart C, and they are going to be controlling that hazard and implementing preventive controls. But who is their supplier in this situation? The answer now is that biofuels manufacturer. Okay, because the biofuels manufacturer did something of consequence to that product. They were the last ones that did something of consequence to it. So now if the feed mill wanted to, they could ask that biofuels manufacturer to control this particular hazard for them and establish a supply chain applied control. Okay, so the other thing that isn't talked about on this particular slide is where like brokers fall into this situation. And I think a lot of brokers kind of like to keep their suppliers secret, I guess, or confidential, because if they release that information to the person they're selling to, well, then they can get bypassed and then they lose business. But under this regulation, the FDA has basically said, hey, brokers, deal with it. This is what the regulation says now. We need to be able to hold those suppliers accountable for controlling the hazards. Okay, so kind of an interesting part of the regulation there. I hope that all makes sense. You can definitely reference the regulation itself if you want a little bit more detail. And again, there's always that preamble that you can go to for a little bit of context and explanation on these things. So to summarize the purpose of that particular exercise, the supplier is the establishment that manufactures or processes the animal food, raises the animal, or grows the animal food without further manufacturing or processing by another establishment. And suppliers and intermediaries may be exempt from the preventive controls for animal food rule. So we saw that even though farmers have an exemption to Part 507, they can be kind of roped into it by being a supplier within a supply chain applied control. Now that we have an idea of who the players are in this supply chain program, we're going to talk about some of the requirements and kind of what a supply chain applied control looks like. So the basics here are that these are used as a preventive control when the ingredient or raw material is controlled by the supplier. The receiving facility is still responsible for implementing this supply chain program and this supply chain applied control. And there's going to be some certain things that they are going to have to do to make sure that supplier is actually controlling the hazard. And as usual, since this is part of the food safety plan, it has to be written down. Here are the different aspects of a supply chain program, and these are all included in Subpart E, and we're going to go through each one of these in the next few slides, but here's a little preview of what's actually required within a supply chain applied control. First and foremost, we're going to be using approved suppliers. Now, as a receiving facility that is implementing the preventive control, the receiving facility is the only entity that can approve a supplier for their supply chain program. Okay, so they can get help in doing these. They can gather information from other sources, but the ultimate decision has to be up to the receiving facility, since they're the ones that are ultimately responsible for controlling that hazard. We can, of course, we have relationships with brokers and distributors that talk to these suppliers. So gathering information from those sources, I think makes a lot of sense and is probably a good idea. But you can't just be given a list from your broker and your broker says, these are your approved suppliers. The receiving facility needs to go through the steps to approve those suppliers, and they have to make that ultimate decision. Now, within the supply chain program, it says that you can only buy these products from approved suppliers. However, there's a couple of lines of regulation that says that if you need to buy from someone else on a temporary basis for whatever reason, you can still do that as long as you do some verification and some checking of that supplier before you actually bring that product into your facility. Number 3 of the requirements said that you need to have written procedures that the facility follows to document that when you receive ingredients, they are coming from approved suppliers. Okay, so we need to have a written procedure for when this truck arrives at the door. What do I need to check for? How does that actually get brought into the facility? And how do I make sure it's coming from approved suppliers? So you need to have written procedures for receiving raw materials and other ingredients, and that actually has a specific description and definition within this regulation that we'll look at in just a second. The facility may develop these documents or rely on another entity for their development, so it doesn't have to be the receiving facility. You can use someone else's procedure as long as it's documented in your food safety plan. The facility can ensure and document written procedures are being followed or rely on another entity for this assurance and documentation. So I think that's kind of speaking to when you have your transportation company involved in doing some of this receiving and dropping off of ingredients. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an employee of the receiving facility carrying out these written procedures. Here's the definition of written procedures for receiving raw materials and other ingredients. So what does that actually mean? What does that look like? Written procedures to ensure that raw materials and other ingredients are received only from suppliers approved by the receiving facility, or when necessary and appropriate on a temporary basis from unapproved suppliers whose raw materials or other ingredients are subjected to adequate verification activities before acceptance for use. Okay, so really all this is your written down procedure, your list of steps for what it looks like when raw materials come to your facility, and how you can make sure that they are only being received from approved suppliers. Okay. Number 4 of the requirements was determining, conducting, and documenting appropriate supplier verification activities. So essentially what that means is, how do you decide how you're going to check to make sure your supplier is actually controlling that hazard? And then how are you going to conduct those activities and document all of those activities? So this is double checking that your suppliers are doing what you've asked them to do. So the receiving facility must determine the appropriate supplier verification activities. Some examples of these activities, I think a common one is going to be auditing. Those audits can come from the receiving facility, the supplier, a third party, the FDA. Whoever it makes sense to do that auditing can be considered a verification activity. Sampling and testing, when you do actually receive those ingredients, maybe doing a test and hold procedure as part of your receiving those raw ingredients. Those suppliers are usually going to have food safety records. Maybe they even have a formal food safety plan that you can review. You can also review things like monitoring records and corrective action records as part of this verification activity. Other procedures or verification activities as your food safety team sees fit. You do, however, need to identify the frequency that you are going to do these verification activities at. So again, that kind of comes back to like designing these verification activities as appropriate and then conducting them according to that plan. The second part of the fourth bullet point of the requirements is the actual conducting part. So other entities may conduct and document supplier verification activities, but receiving facilities must review and assess applicable documentation. So there are some restrictions on what suppliers can do for you, but for the most part, we can rely on other entities, third parties, or even the supplier themselves to do some of these verification activities. But ultimately, I think that receiving facility needs to be looking over those records and making sure that they are in agreement with what the contract between the supplier and the receiving facility is asking for, and that they're being done thoroughly and appropriately. Activities must be completed before using raw material or other ingredients and periodically thereafter. So I think this kind of follows the same intent of some of the other regulation that we've looked at before. Ideally, all of these things happen before you start using these ingredients, and then figure out a frequency that makes sense to do them periodically after that, after you start using them. Supply chain program must provide assurance that a hazard requiring a preventive control has been significantly minimized or prevented. Okay, so this assurance is going to be an actual legal document between the supplier and the receiving facility that says the supplier is controlling or significantly minimizing those hazards. The last part of this subsection, this part 4 of the requirements, is the documentation piece. And like I said, some of that documentation is going to be those assurances, that legal document, acknowledging that that's a legal document. And then you also need to make sure that any of the documents produced are in accordance with subpart F, which was our record keeping section of this rule. These next couple of slides are going to discuss how to decide that a supplier can be an approved supplier and what those appropriate verification activities are going to be for any particular supplier. So when we're thinking about these things, of course, we need to come back to the hazard analysis and the decisions that were made through that hazard analysis process. That's kind of our like guiding document for all of our preventive controls, right? So that makes sense to come back to that, that thought process and those decisions. We also need to consider the entity applying the controls that are actually controlling this hazard for us. And supplier performance, things like supplier procedures, processes, and practices related to that particular ingredient. Is there any FDA compliance records available, and has the supplier been in compliance or ever not been in compliance with FDA regulations? Supplier's food safety history that's relevant to that raw material. So really looking at your supplier's performance in the past, thinking about their manufacturing processes, and seeing if it makes sense or what makes sense for them to be able to do to control that hazard for you. And that includes things like their storage and transportation practices. When we're thinking about an appropriate verification activity, as I mentioned before, I think auditing is going to be a common thing that should be built in in addition to some of these other verification activities. However, this regulation 507.35 says that an audit is only required if you are dealing with a SECOTA hazard. Those are serious adverse health consequences or deaths to humans or animals. Okay, so these are the very extreme hazards that are very high risk situations. So if you're dealing with a SECOTA hazard, an audit is a required verification activity. Okay, and this has to be performed by a qualified auditor, and we'll look at a definition of who a qualified auditor is in just a second. And just know that there are some like training opportunities and training programs coming out to help people identify and get trained to be a qualified auditor, but that's kind of being rolled out at the time that I made this recording. But I think the definition will kind of speak to what we're looking for from a qualified auditor. The audit does have to include a review of FDA food safety regulations, the supplier's actual written food safety system, and how they're implementing that written food safety system. A food safety related compliance inspection by the FDA or another agency can substitute for this required audit as long as it's within 1 year of when you're wanting to do that audit. Okay. And while this is only required for Sakota hazards, I think it's going to be common and it may be appropriate for other types of hazards. Here's your definition of a qualified auditor that I promised you. This is a person who is qualified, who is a qualified individual, which we've looked at that definition before, and has technical experience obtained through education, training, or experience, or the combination thereof, necessary to perform the auditing function. I think that's kind of a broad statement, but it does kind of give you some guidelines. Is this person actually trained and educated to do the auditing function? Examples of potential auditors could include a government employee, including a foreign government employee, and an audit agent of a certification body that is accredited in accordance with regulations in Part 1, Subpart M of this chapter, which is the actual accredited third-party certification rule. Okay? So ideally, they're going to be fitting into one of those categories, but this is just examples. It doesn't necessarily have to be one of those two options. Another appropriate verification activity, and I think a common one that we're going to see with these types of preventive controls, is going to be sampling and testing. Again, as I mentioned earlier, these can be conducted by the supplier, the receiving facility upon receipt, or even an outside lab or a third party. However, all of those records should be reviewed as just kind of good business practice for making sure this sampling and testing is being done correctly and that those results are showing what you want them to say. These results can be communicated in a COA. I think that makes a lot of sense. The methods, however, need to be fit for the purpose. I think that's kind of common sense, but just, reiterating, thinking through your design here and really making sure you're going to the best scientific information available to make sure that you're doing this appropriately. You can consult references on appropriate tests for different types of products, and I think a good example of this is that like indicator tests are sometimes more useful than actual pathogen tests to assess the effectiveness of overall controls. We also talked a little bit about ATP testing a little bit earlier, and we've got some really good science and really good research coming out with that type of testing as well. Some other verification activities, I think I've mentioned most of these. Reviewing records. The supplier is going to be doing some monitoring of this preventive control, whatever preventive control they're implementing to control that hazard or whatever activity they're implementing to control that hazard. So you can review those records as part of your verification activity. Requesting certificates of conformance, requesting continuing guarantees. I think that all makes a lot of good sense, good business practice. These are the last couple of required components for a supply chain applied control. Number 5 says implementing the appropriate management components. So just like our other preventive controls, we have required management components that we need to make sure we're doing to make sure that this control is being implemented as it was designed and that it is actually still effective. And then number 6, documentation. If you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So keeping track of all of these documents and all of these COAs and all of these audits is absolutely critical to supporting the fact that the supply chain applied control is working as intended. Here's this graphic again. We've seen this a few times already, but just to kind of reorient ourselves, we're in the third column here of our supply chain applied control, and the green check marks are going to tell us which management components are required for this type of control. And you'll notice right off the bat that monitoring is not required. Okay, and that's mostly because the actual monitoring is going to be done by the supplier themselves in-house in their facility. Most of what we're doing to I guess kind of monitor this control is those verification activities that we just covered. So reviewing their monitoring records, looking at their food safety plan, and auditing them, sampling and testing, that all falls under the verification activities. Okay, we do, however, need to have corrective actions and corrections in place. So remember, these are carried out when a preventive control is not implemented as intended. So theoretically, your verification activities are going to show some red flags. If the situation arises where your supplier is not controlling the hazard, and so you need to have some procedures in place for how you're going to deal with that situation and how you're going to document it. Validation, again, that's going to be something that the supplier is doing. It's kind of difficult to validate that a supplier can control a hazard for you. But of course, verification activities are going to be huge. That's kind of the biggest part of this supply chain program, is verifying that the supplier is doing what you've asked them to do. So let's think again about what corrective actions look like. This plan and the records required or that are going to be made in conjunction with this plan are similar to what we saw in the other types of preventive controls, and they need to make sure to, again, address those 5 big bullet points that we've seen several times. Number 1, identify and correct the problem. Number 2, reduce the likelihood that the problem will recur. Number 3, evaluate all affected animal food for safety. Number 4, prevent affected animal food from entering commerce as necessary, and reanalyze the food safety plan as appropriate. Here is a short list of all of the records that are going to be produced through a supply chain program under this regulation. So just by kind of glancing over this, we can see that there's going to be a lot of them, right? Because this is asking someone else to control this hazard for you, you need to document that they are doing all of this, that you've justified how that they are approved. You're going to have sampling and testing and verification records. You're going to have corrective action plans and records. So just trying to reiterate and really kind of drive the point home here that this requires a lot of record keeping and a lot of control. So here we are to exercise 9, part 2, and this is kind of just a question and answer session. So I'm just going to talk through each of these questions and each of these answers, and as I pose the question, I'd like you to ask yourself and see if you can answer this question. If that means you need to pause in between, please feel free to do that. So the first question is, who can approve suppliers? Answer? Only the receiving facility, okay? They're the only ones that can ultimately make that decision. Can other entities provide help gathering material to help the receiving facility approve suppliers? Answer? Yes, as long as it is the receiving facility who is doing the approving of the suppliers. Next question. And other entities that do not manufacture or process the product provide the receiving facility a letter of assurance they have approved suppliers in order to maintain supplier anonymity. So this question is trying to get at that like broker situation. Can other entities give you a list and say these are your approved suppliers? Answer: no, they may not. Only the receiving facility can approve the supplier. So 3 questions there, also trying to just drive home the point of, the receiving facility is the only one that can approve suppliers. Next question. Who can conduct supplier verification activities like on-site audits, sampling and testing, reviewing the supplier's animal food safety records? Answer: the receiving facility or another entity that the receiving facility has charged with the activity, as long as the receiving facility reviews and assesses appropriate documentation. Okay, so what that's saying is the receiving facility can do these activities, or they can get some help with that as long as they are overseeing it. So to summarize that, of course, only the receiving facility can approve suppliers. Verification activities are the responsibility of the receiving facility, but they may designate others to conduct those activities for them. A couple other things that I want to say about the supply chain programs, and then we're going to look at an example of what this would look like in a food safety plan. First of all, there's some just general like good business practices when it comes to supply chains that I want to make sure you're aware of. So first of all, when changes happen, there needs to be some sort of procedure to communicate those changes between the receiving facility and the supplier and the food safety team and the PCQI. So thinking about that as you're building these supply chain preventive controls is important. Make sure you have like written procedures down and written expectations for your supplier for notifying you when they are going to make some changes. Periodic reevaluation, as with the rest of the food safety plan, I think that's a definitely important key here to make sure you're reevaluating these, making sure that your approved suppliers should still be approved to buy product from, and that kind of thing. And of course, adjusting the program as needed to enhance the food safety, especially if you're doing corrective actions or have problems, or that reevaluation throws up some red flags that changes need to be made. And of course, as always, reanalyze that food safety plan if those types of things are happening and you find some deficiencies. Okay, just as a reminder, there is a specific piece of the regulation that says how often you need to reanalyze the food safety plan. Do you remember what it is? How often do you need to reanalyze your food safety plan? If you said every 3 years or as needed, then you are spot on and you've at least walked away with that piece of information from this course. So good job. Okay, one other thing about the supply chain program here. This is kind of a graphic that shows us some like records flow. So just kind of reiterating how these things flow and what we need to do with them at each step. So first and foremost, the records that we're starting with is that hazard analysis, right? So that justification that we do have a hazard that needs a preventive control. And then some records and some justification that says that a supply chain applied control is the best control for this. After we've made that decision, then we need to go through that supplier approval process, documenting all of that and those decisions, and establishing those verification activities for each of our suppliers. Keep in mind those verification activities might look different supplier to supplier. One of the things we were considering is supplier history, so that could look very different between different supplier facilities. So that's kind of our next step in the records. From that point, when we have that established and we have our supply chain applied control running, then we may have to conduct some corrective actions, but of course we're going to produce some records through that as well. So we'll have records and documentation of that, and then we'll also always justify and document when we review or reanalyze the food safety plan. Okay, let's take a look at an example of this. So here we are back in ABC feed mill. Remember, we're making livestock feed. One of our big hazards was copper toxicity in this facility. So here's the first part of table 1. This was a chemical hazard, copper toxicity, that came in from our ingredients, okay? Here was our justification through our hazard analysis process. We decided that yes, it does need a preventive control. We've looked at all of the other preventive controls we decided for this particular hazard, but we are also going to implement a supply chain control, which is going to be the control of copper level in the sheep mineral premix. Okay, so remember, we're buying a premix from another facility. So we're going to ask them to control this hazard by making sure they're making their premix correctly. Okay? We don't have any parameters established with this. We did identify it as a supply chain control. Remember that those parameters are going to be established within the supplier facility. I've had some conversations with people, again, that like NA, having NA anywhere is going to kind of catch the eye of an inspector. So I've had some conversations with people about maybe including the parameters that you and your supplier have agreed upon in this particular box, just so that that's documented and you know what you're looking for. But at this point, we left it as an NA just to kind of reiterate the fact that it's being controlled over in the supplier facility, and this isn't a parameter that you as the receiving facility are keeping track of. The other kind of situation that I've talked about as far as a parameter goes could be, did I get my COA when I received this product or did I not? Okay, so kind of a yes or no parameter established there, whether we got the proper documentation and the supplier did what they were asked to do. For the management components, remember, we're not required to do monitoring because the monitoring is being conducted by the supplier. Corrective actions, though, we have those in place. These look kind of similar to some of the other ones that we've seen related to this hazard. And then the records section shows us a COA from the supplier, records reviewing the COA by the supplier, supplier approval and verification documentation, and record of annual audits. Here's table 3 that shows us our verification activities. Again, just to kind of reiterate here that with a supply chain applied control, verification is absolutely critical, right? This is kind of our biggest ways to make sure this is actually happening. So, validation was not a required component here, but there are other verification activities that we decided we needed to do. One of them was going to be that annual on-site audit using COAs for assurance of incoming copper concentration. So at every batch or every truck that comes in, we have that COA. Quarterly analysis of sheep trace mineral premix by the supplier to verify proper copper levels do not exceed the values established through the supply chain applied control via a certificate of analysis. Okay, so this is an example of the supplier doing some sampling and testing and then sending us a certificate of analysis, and we use that as part of verification. And then lastly, reviewing the records of the supplier's food safety plan for sequencing and flushing procedures to prevent carryover of copper into the sheep trace mineral premix. So that could be like looking at their monitoring records or their corrective action records to verify that they're following the procedures as you guys agreed on. Reanalysis every 3 years or as necessary. So let's summarize all of Chapter 9 here. This is a type of preventive control if you have a hazard requiring a preventive control and your food safety team decides that the supply chain applied control is the most appropriate way to control it. Some key definitions that we talked about: a supplier manufactures food, grows food, or raises animals, does something of consequence, and a receiving facility is a manufacturer or processor. Some key requirements here. You have to use approved suppliers. You have to have written receiving procedures and documents to go along with that. Determining and conducting and documenting all of those verification activities is absolutely critical, and documentation is a key element. And that wraps up Chapter 9. I hope that was helpful for understanding supply chain applied controls. You will have a part of an assignment to go along with this chapter to kind of reiterate some of these concepts.